Wow, you can
Welcome.
stream live on Facebook. Wow.
Here we are. Listen, I want to welcome everyone to this very joyful moment for me. So, welcome, friends and family and fellow warrior sages. I want to introduce um, a very special, sister, very special keeper of deep wisdom. She is an Indigenous Wisdom Keeper. When I first met her, there was this just a, like there was this deep inner joy, and then I got to meet her family, and she just has such a wonderful family, and you have a heart of gold, and that's what I wanted to share. But please, I want to introduce my friend Diane Hill and to welcome everyone. All right,
Thanks, Sache.
Diane, share a little bit about
So,
your back. Share a little bit about your whatever maybe something to open us up.
share a little bit about me. Okay. I always have a hard time with that question because my mind starts immediately going backwards to the time that I've spent um, becoming, I guess, who I am. So it's been a lifelong journey. It's been a lifelong learning journey through experiences and informal academic education as well. But the real emphasis, I think, the importance that I place more on my life experiences on the school of life and what I've learned through that journey to bring me to where I am today. Certainly, I have the university credentials for adult education and as an educator with university degrees, but it's so funny because it's not that which I entered into. I didn't enter into mainstream education. I went in the back door, what some people would call the back door, which is really about alternative education. So I went into out of the box modalities, and so I ended up teaching social work of all things in the social service worker program for a Aboriginal owned and operated facility, a post-secondary education institute. It was called the First Nations Technical Institute, and it was owned by the Mohawk tribe at the Bay of Quinte, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. And they were my people, they're also my people because I'm Mohawk and I'm a Bear Clan member, but I come from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. So I'm about 3.5 hours west of the Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory where I started teaching many years ago. I can't even remember the exact date when I started in, but I taught for 24 years in that post-secondary institution, and I stayed there because it was outside of the mainstream umbrella, and it allowed us to do things that were out of the box. So we got to create courses, and we created courses, my team and I, that I was a part of, the teaching team. We created a more like a learning modality that was workshop-based as opposed to course-based. And so we were able to then spend time with adult learners in self-directed learning programs. And so to do that, we had to develop learning strategies that would fit adult learners who were coming from First Nations or Aboriginal communities who didn't have formal education, yet had a myriad and a wealth of life experiences. So we wanted to be able to do an assessment of that learning. And so back then, we were fortunate to have access to a strategy in the province of Ontario called prior learning assessment. And prior learning assessment, or the recognition of prior learning as it's known in other provinces and around the world, actually, that was new for us at First Nations Technical Institute. But we were a team of Native and non-Native individuals working together. And my managers were both non-Native, and they had a foresight and a vision to let us let the Native staff to let us step forward in the design of an educational training package for social workers who were going to work at the college level, were being certified at the college level, and they were going to work in First Nations communities. And by that time, a lot of us had had enough experience with mainstream education, with Western education, to know that mainstream teaching didn't always work. And we wanted to create a program, a training program for social workers who are working in Indigenous communities. And we wanted those workers to be culturally proficient as well as occupationally skilled. So we wanted them to have the best of both worlds. In other words, we wanted them to have their cultural proficiencies and awareness, because that we understood that as a result of colonization and residential school impact on First Nations, that we had to make a concerted effort to reclaim and revitalize our own culture, our own teachings, our own philosophy, our own practices. So we took prior learning assessment and we tweaked it. We like to say we indigenized it, and we made it work for Indigenous learners. And what we created was a holistic learning model that looked at learning on 4 levels, or 4 quadrants, we call them. We looked at the mental and the emotional and the physical and the spiritual realms of an individual. And we said all that learning needed to be brought forward, and that if we could get them to articulate learning into a portfolio. So we developed a portfolio development system of life experiences, and we could teach learning analysis in such a way that a learner, even if you didn't go to formal education, you could still extract learning that was equivalent to the college competencies. So we didn't have to teach. So for example, we didn't have to teach the psychology of oppression because our people lived it. And we could take the experience of having lived culturally oppressed and be able to reframe it and rework it in a language that allowed us to extract learning and to articulate that learning into 4 quadrants of knowledge, skills, attitude, and insights. And it was a brilliantly designed model. Nobody else was doing it. Nobody else could apply it. Nobody else knew what to do with First Nations people, because so many of my contemporaries and the people that I was working with, the students I was working with, they didn't have formal education, not a lot. And so we were trying to give them accreditation for their life experience, for what they lived, for lived learning, as opposed to what they learned from a book. And so oddly enough, don't ask me how it happened, but I just worked from my heart, and I worked at what I understood was the correct way to help people to heal, because you can't do a learning assessment and say, tell us about your life experiences and only tell us the good things. We couldn't say only share the good things, because most of First Nations people were coming out of cultures that have been oppressed, and there was lots of pain and lots of suffering, and there were lots of addictions and lots of problems in the First Nations. So we said, tell us everything you experienced, and in the process of that telling, you're probably going to heal, and we'll teach you a way of healing and working through those painful moments so that you can reframe them into the beautiful knowledge and the really advanced understanding that you don't even think you have, but that we know is carried within you once you can release the heavy emotional energy, the wounds that are causing you to downplay or to dismiss your life experiences. So even the most painful of life experience produced the most profound learning. And it was learning that really pushed people, and they had never, for the first time, Aboriginal learners had never had the opportunity to look at themselves in that way. So they saw that life experience wasn't just, that I got myself beat up, and I got told I was a dirty Indian, or told that I wasn't smart. Yeah, that happened to me, but through that experience, I got to see how in surviving it and being able to heal from it, I started seeing how it shaped me into the person that I am today, how it actually gave me skills, knowledge, some really values that I came to appreciate, and some insights about how to help not just myself, but to help my family and to help my community. So we were producing learners who could go home with that kind of wisdom, that kind of view about themselves. So self-help and self-healing has always been my passions. And I've always been able to roll those ideas and into techniques and activities and I guess you would say strategies, even though I don't really like the word strategy, but into processes where people can start to stand up for themselves and to work through the painful parts of life and realize that you can come through it with more confidence and more self-esteem and a lot more wisdom than you thought you had. And so that self-discovery, it became a self-discovery experiential learning process because we had to hold a lot of healing circles. And you didn't find a lot of healing circles at that time back in the 80s when I was doing this in the late 80s, early 90s, but we were the forerunners for that. And so suddenly I became this international expert in prior learning assessment for the work that I was doing and the programs that I was coordinating and the groups of learners that I took through. And so I got to travel the world from that model. But then the healing was always the passion. So eventually I would retire from First Nations Technical Institute as a teacher in 2010. And then I came back to my own community here at Six Nations at the Grand River. And I built a healing lodge and I run a privately owned and operated healing lodge now for small group processes because we really do intensive healing work here. We do body-based work. We help individuals transform. It's not just a release work because some people look at what we do and they think it's just a release work, but it's not. It's a transformative process where people are able to really heal and then change their thinking, which is what I noticed, which became what my professor friends, my university professors would say, a decolonizing methodology. So in the community, we were calling it healing, but at the university level, they were saying we were brilliant because we were decolonizing people, but we were using body-based emotional healing work. We were focusing on the emotions, using the body as a way to transform that heavy-duty trauma, heavy-duty drama experiences, letting the body transform the feelings, and having done that, the thinking sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's most of the time, the thinking automatically changes. You get a different view of yourself. Your thinking about yourself changes. You think differently about others. You think differently about the world more broadly. And so it became a really revolutionary process, an innovative process that we were doing here, but in small group process. And I had been doing it like bits and pieces of it since I started teaching way back in 1986. So fast forward to 2010, I'm now running my own healing lodge based on that model. And at this stage of the game, people are saying, when are you going to start writing this book? When are you going to write it down and start sharing what you know? And so we're starting that now, eh? We're just now starting since COVID. I can thank COVID for the break and the pause because I don't have to, I can stay home now. And it gave me an ideal time frame for me to actually start refocusing myself and probably on this task of writing down what I know. And it would be the follow-up to a book that I already wrote with some colleagues in 1986, which talked about what happens when you internalize oppression, when a people create an identity, that's based on being victimized, and how that creates problems and how the social dysfunction occurs from that, and then how you can turn all of that around so that we called it ethnostress, and how you can turn that ethnostress around and start healing from it and then reclaiming and regaining your humanity. But the beauty about what we said in 1986 to what I'm saying now in 2020 is in 1986, we were only pro-Aboriginal, right? We just it was for Aboriginal people only. And now in 2020, it's a human problem. So it's all people need to have help decolonizing. Even the colonizer needs to have help to deconstruct and to unpack his or her guilt, or the cultural ways that they were raised were just as important as what we were unpacking as being like the colonized people on the other end of the spectrum. So that's been the gist of my work in a nutshell, Sachin. And it's a lifelong journey. Like I said, it's not something I started yesterday. It's something that I started in 1986 by starting, and I do that work consistently on myself. So that work, as it remains today, I'm still decolonizing myself from certain ways that I was raised with, and certain things I believe, and certain things that aren't working for me anymore. I say, as Dr. Phil would say, it's, how's that working for you? I'd take it apart, I'd sit with it, I'd find out where the source of that problem is for me, and release the emotional anchor that's anchoring it into my body, and then I would come out with a whole brand new perspective and another way of looking at myself and others in the world more broadly. And it's just a process that just keeps playing itself out over and over again. And I guess the real thrust now is rather than me being the delivery agent, I'm the one in the delivering. There's been more push for me to be the teacher, to be the one to teach others to do that work with other people, as opposed to me being the one that's doing the work. But to teach others, can you train others? Can you teach other people how to do this? And over the years, I tried it, and I came out with probably 5 people I can count on my hand who could probably replace me in the chair. But I had hoped there would be more than 5 people, but I also came across the idea that this isn't everybody's cup of tea. High emotions, high intensity, emotional work and trauma work isn't for everybody. But if you can do it, and you can handle it, you see a transformation that's so clean and sustainable, right? So, like, yeah, we're always going to have some degree of triggers, but the beauty about what I like about this process, once you engage the body, is that it clears it, and at the level of the nervous system, so that the triggers become less and less and less. Yes. And that's what that's kind of the beauty about the model. So that's me and what I do. And I do it from an Aboriginal perspective. I mean, we the process itself, if I was to tell you about that, would be a whole nother interview, because we rooted in the body-based process is rooted in Haudenosaunee culture, and a story of a gentleman called Tadadahu, who was given the position of overseeing the council of 50 chiefs in traditional times. But it's the story of how he became healed, that and transformed, that and that enabled him to sit in that high position. That's the story that's of great interest. And sometimes I teach that story, and sometimes we just, depending on what group I'm addressing, sometimes it just makes better sense for people to hear it from a scientific point of view of how the body is able to heal itself. So I can move between the quantum sciences, the cellular biology, neuroplasticity, epigenetics. We can go there if we have to, or we can just stay in ancient culture and say very simple story, which has profound wisdom to a very simple story. But no one's ever thought about these stories as profound wisdom. They just say, that's a nice little story you're telling. It's a nice legend, or it's a nice myth. And they don't see the practical application. So part of my work has always been to interpret those ancient stories and be able to put them in a way that other people can understand them, that they have modern application. So, yeah, so that I spent almost all my life just working with indigenous populations. Only since 2012 maybe, did I start with opening up the Healing Lodge here to all cultures. Everybody comes, all cultures come here now. But that wasn't the way I started. I had to, and not because I was holding any kind of prejudice or racism. It's just because Western culture mainstream has been privileged for so long. I wanted to privilege my own. So I spent a lot of time working with my own people and bringing their knowledge and understanding their cultural bent, not just because everybody has had some kind of background and creation story and lots of legends and stories that were not just childhood amusements. They were deep, profound teachings, if you could understand that. So I spent a lot of time, that's almost another university degree, just to go into Indigenous studies, Indigenous people's cultural philosophies. And that was on top of anything else I might have been doing in the mainstream from the degree aspect. So I ended up being called a bridge. I never set out to be called a bridge. I just became that. And so people used to consult, or they would hire me to come in, and I would have to interpret what the traditional people were saying into modern Western vernacular. And then I would have to take what the Western mainstream university people were saying to the traditional Indigenous people, and then I would have to translate that into a language that they understood. And we were all speaking English. So it was just kind of, I ended up being this bridge between these two worlds, and became a blend of it myself in a lot of ways. The problem with it sometimes, not always, but I don't kind of fit in a traditional model really if you looked at a pure traditional model, I couldn't really sit there, and I couldn't really sit in a mainstream model either, because I have too much of the cultural understanding and beliefs that are kind of 180 degrees contrary to the beliefs that mainstream is professing. So I sit as a bridge. It seems to work, and it helps a lot of people make sense. It helps them make sense. That's kind of it in a lot. And there's a word for that in Mohawk language that I had to research and find out, because I didn't kind of know where I fit. But when I found out that there was actually a word for people like me who can bridge those two cultures, then I thought, wow, okay, that's good. That's who I am. That's what I've always
What is
done,
that
and it's
word?
kind of nice to know.
What do
Go
you
in,
have?
no. It just means that she thinks about, or he thinks about things and reflects on things. So it isn't that I'm taking you at literal value. I'm looking at what's being presented, and I'm looking for the things that aren't as obvious. I'm seeing the things and pulling the wisdom and pulling the insights that are available. So it's someone who reflects on things and then is able to put it together in a package and in a presentation, so that whether it's verbal or written, and it makes sense to people. So that's the bridge, hey? It's someone who reflects. So that was fine. So that's kind of how I see myself today, and not in one or the other, but just as a spirit, a very deep soul, a long old soul that just has compassion and is here to help people. So even the gender stuff, I don't get hung up on that. I don't get hung up on the culture, the race stuff. I'm sort of looking for souls as opposed to looking for the way I used to be. I had to, where I thought it was just our people, where I would only work or only teach with our people because I thought that we had already had enough damage done to us, and my people needed to be uplifted more than anyone. And now I start to realize that all people need to be uplifted. All people need to be taught. We're all in this together, in this world together. And sometimes the people who need the help the most turned out to be not Indigenous, but non-Indigenous peoples. And so that's kind of where I changed, where I've come to today. Wow. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
yes, thank
it's
you.
a long journey.
I want to honor you, first of all, for this lifetime of dedication, Diane. It's like, and the amount of people and the depth of people you must serve, currently serving, and the ripples I can feel it. So just, I'm very grateful. Diane, I'd like to,
Well, thank you.
share with us a story, please, about this time, and how you see, or the indigenous wisdoms express where we are.
Hmm. Well, I don't know whether it's a story as much as we would call it a prophecy. But for my people, we're called Haudenosaunee people, which means we're the people who lived in the long bark houses, and we come from a really ancient culture. I always say that I'm descended from highly evolved, deeply spiritual people of peace, and that peace was the forerunner. That those articles of peace that were put together, and in the articles of peace, I guess you could call it, were put together and held in physical strings, what they call wampums or wampum belts. And so the wampum belts were carried symbols, and they carried teachings and memories, if oral tradition. And so those belts became very important records, like history books. They were records of relationships and teachings of how we were to get along with non-Indigenous or other peoples. And so one of the ones that keeps coming to mind, which was really instrumental early on in my early days when I was learning about my own culture, because I didn't grow up schooled in the culture. It would be something that I would have to come back to and learn as a young adult, because I was curious about who I was and what did it mean to be Mohawk, and what did it mean to live on this reserve, and who were the Six Nations people, and so I had to discover all of that. And when I searched and I started learning about my own people, which is learning about myself, I discovered this prophecy around a wampum belt called the everlasting tree, or ever growing tree. And that wampum belt talked about a prophecy that said that that the great peace in the world, and the peace in the world would come, that turmoil would come and conflict would come, and it would be at such a high degree and such an intensity that it would shake what we referred to as our symbol, which is a tree of peace, which is a great white pine. And they said the great white pine tree would start to shake. It would start to rock, and it said it would start to fall to the ground. That the peace that as we would know it would start to fall to the ground. But before it hit the ground, they said the tree would be caught. The tree of peace would be caught by those people who were standing shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, locked together, that we would hold up. It would fall on the shoulders and on the arms of the people who still believed and still knew how to bring about the peace and the great peace. And so we would be the ones to catch it, stand the tree up, and then restore the peace. And in doing so, they said any nation, all kinds of nations of people, non-Indigenous people, would then turn to Indigenous populations, and they would come to us to learn about peace once again. And they would come to us so that we would be the ones to stand up. The tree of peace would grow again. It would be an ever growing, ever evolving, tree. And so the symbol of the tree, is very important, because it represents life. And so the growing of that tree, reaching up towards the heavens. If you will look at the branches, they're pointing up. They're raising up and to the heavens, and they have roots, really long roots. And our tree of peace they talked about symbolically 4 white roots of peace. And those white roots of peace would travel in 4 directions. And they said any nation, not just Aboriginal people, not just First Nations people, but any nation of people who desired and was curious and wanted to learn about the great peace, could follow any one of those roots and come and seek refuge under that great tree by being willing to bury their weapons of war. And so this was a story that touched me really, really deeply when years ago. Of course, I didn't understand it metaphorically. I didn't even know, how to do that back then. But today, the way that I see the peace is it's an inner peace. So it isn't a peace between nations. It's possible to have a peace between nations, but your peace is going to come first within inside of you. So if you can achieve an inner peace, then the inner peace echoes. It's expressed to the world and it echoes back. So your external reality is going to be shaped by your internal reality, and the two go together. And so I think at this time, and there are other what I call sub stories to that one, but the sub story would be the story of Tadadaho, the gentleman who was known as the guy with the hair of snakes, and he was the one I mentioned earlier, whose healing and transformation allowed him to find and connect to that inner peace within inside of him. But it also helped to straighten out the mind. They were able to comb the snakes out of his hair, and the snakes are both literal snakes. There's a reason for that, but a metaphorical snake would be like twisted thoughts, negative thinking, limited thinking, and you would be able to comb the snakes. Could be combed out of a person's hair. Once they were able to encounter the great peace within them, then it just stand to follow that the snakes would fall from the hair, and the thinking would become right thinking, not right as in right or wrong, but righteous in the terms of the proper, I don't even know, I'm struggling for words here, but thinking that would make it righteous, like a good mindedness, and from a good minded point of view. So in the story of Tadadaho, he was helped to be healed by the chiefs and by the clan mother, the woman who became the first clan mother, and her name's Jagunsase. And that story is one of the cornerstones of my people's culture, of Haudenosaunee culture. And I took a great interest in I never let it go. And to this day, I kept wondering, how did he heal? How did you do that? What had to be done? What were the processes? And I like to believe I figured that out. And so that's when we came into the body-based process. But it was teaching this way of healing in such a way that it would open the heart and focus on the heart and the body more than the mind. And I didn't understand at first that the mind, which was ego-driven, and a lot of my Western education had put me in my mind, ego mind. And so I learned how to be an academic in the early stages. And in order to be able to be cultural and to live and to understand my people's culture, I had to unlearn, and I had to get out of the ego mind and come down into a heart-centered living and heart-centered basis. It was tough. It wasn't easy, because I had to open up my own heart, which meant there was a lot of wounds inside of myself, and I had to learn how to let those go. And so just like the story in Tadadaho, when we said we would teach people, they would come to us to ask us, how do you achieve this? How did you achieve this great peace? Because it was the wampum belt shows a record of 5 warring nations that put their weapons aside, found peace, and developed a confederacy, later to be 6 nations confederacy. And then those articles of peace were the forerunners for the present Constitution of the United States of America. So Ben Franklin and those guys copied. They didn't take it all, but they should have probably done well if they took it all, but they didn't. They only took pieces of the democracy and the peace and the coming together of 13 colonies was modeled after the coming together of five Haudenosaunee, what the French called the Iroquois nations, right? So we were warring nations, and we came together in peace. So Ben Franklin basically said, if savages can find peace and come together and form a confederacy, then surely us educated men can find a peace, and they became the 13 colonies and the forerunner for the present United States of America. So not very many people know that. It's documented in books and places, but not many people understand that a lot of the present things that happened had their roots in Indigenous people's knowledges. And I think Indigenous people have always been so giving and so willing to share that a lot of our practices and a lot of our teachings, you know, right down to friends of mine would say even Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs was based on an Indigenous people's thinking. Erik Erikson, the psychologist, Carl Jung, the dream therapist, and you know, all based on Seneca dream techniques and philosophies. And so these people were academics, and they were, you know, they're leaders in their field, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, everybody kind of knows what that's about. And Erickson's developmental stages of life were borrowed from the Blackfoot tribe. And Carl Jung's dream interpretation came from the Seneca, and on and on and on, right? There've been references now that Indigenous people know, or the underpinnings for modern psychology and different ways of thinking and social studies. And I mean, all these things that these people are now touted for and known for had their roots in Indigenous knowledges, but we weren't credited for it. We weren't cited, I guess. And you don't cite oral traditions because there's no written text for it, but they borrowed the knowledge and they rolled it into thesis for themselves and then took credit for it without really kind of acknowledging where it came from. So Indigenous knowledges, yeah, we have lots of ways of healing and lots of philosophies for understanding oneness and unity and connectedness through the spiritual understanding, through spiritual knowledge. And if people could see spirit and not color or race, I think we would do well to join together under an umbrella of spiritual connections, as opposed to seeing race or color or gender. So, you know, what's happening today on the news is you know, with the George Floyd situation is much more about you know, showing people what we've become as opposed to what we can become, right? And there's lots of protests, but I think my people have always said, this is what we can become. This is what happens when you disconnect from the soul and the spirit. You'll just see color, you'll just see race. But if you can see, you can stay that connected to the inner soul, the inner being, the inner part of you, which is we're all one people. We're all we all come from the light. And in the end, we'll return to that light. And so it really isn't about the race as much as it is about the soul, the war for the soul, the reconnection. We need to reconnect to that deeper understanding of spirit without color, because spirit doesn't have color. It's an energy. So how do you heal that? Well, that's where I believe our people are a testimony to the healing rites, because we're still here, even though we've lived ourselves through years of cultural genocide and you know, and I think we're supposed to be disseminated or exterminated somehow, but we're still here. So how did you guys survive it? What did you do to survive? Well, we had to do some healing, and we had to do that in such a way that it would honor who we were as a people, but also as the spiritual basis from which we all come. So that's my answer. I think they're going to come and look for a spiritual understanding in this day and age. It's an awakening. Some say it's an awakening of humanity. It's an evolution of consciousness. Great. But what does that mean in terms of the practical? Well, it means you're going to have to let some things go and really start to discover who you are at the root and the core of your being as a spiritual being, not as the human being, but as the spiritual being. The human being's going to have to do some healing in order to integrate the spirit and soul into that human. So for us, it's an integration. It's not a separation. It's not to transcend the human, but it's to work with the human and then bring the soul and bring the spirit soul back together, integrated into that human being, not separate from it. Otherwise, why bother coming to a planet that had a physical body like this if you didn't value it, if you didn't see some purpose for it? So it's not about bypassing it, looking for spirituality to transcend it. It's looking to how do you put up the two together? How do you integrate it and produce a wholeness from that experience, your human experience, eh? So that's part of what we've been teaching, and that's what I see in my culture, in my stories. I see it in a lot of Indigenous people's cultures and stories. But here's the thing: is that our people don't write these things down, which I think is why they're kind of pushing me to write it down, because write some of it down. Not that I'm gonna, I know the whole thing or whatever, but traditionally there's not a lot of written sources for these things that I'm telling you. There really isn't.
They were meant to be transmitted. So instead of knowledge, it's all about knowing, embodiment, living the principles, because that was when we hear oral tradition, it just doesn't mean oral. The guides, the mentors, the teachers, the wise ones were looking for the absorption and the living of these eternal principles, of these principles of natural law. And so,
I agree. And
Diane,
we have, and so I think that's what we're gonna, I think that's what we're gonna contribute. I think and how we're gonna do that, Sachin, like I said, people don't write these things down, but they can talk about it. And some not, they just do it. You know what I mean? They do the ceremony, they do the practice, but they don't necessarily explain it to you. And that's where people like me come in, because I'm the one who reflects on the cultural ceremonial experience. And then I can articulate it in a way that of the how and why you would do that, how it works and why it works, ceremony works. And that's a whole different bent. And I keep hungering and seeking for people like me, because it's really hard to be able, I'm not in the camp that says, here, I'll do the ceremony for you. But if you ask me how it works and why it works, I won't be able to tell you that. There's people like that who can do amazing things, but they can't tell you how and why it works. And then on the other side, there are people there too that are able to articulate how they think it works, or they have the language for it, but they have the science for it. And how it works, energetic sciences, which are the quantum sciences. And if you can put those two together, then I think you have a model that enables people to embrace their humanity. Sorry, cut you off earlier.
No. I'm so receiving and enjoying what you're sharing and letting it in. Diane, I want to ask you, everyone here this is a page for warrior sages. And to me, the warrior is the one who takes action that's grounded in integrity, that is resolute in truth. And then the sage is the one that's grounded in wisdom and in the heart. And it's the whole spectrum. What can you share for us during these times as leaders, as guides? How can we step up? What should we be contemplating? Please give some insight into that. Especially those of us who are healers, those of us who are leaders, those of us who are on the forefront of helping others.
What would you do? All of the stuff that I've done, that I've talked about, I've had to do it for myself first. And so everything that I teach now, the most valuable teachings are those ones that I came from my own experience. So not so much the ones that I read in a book or that I learned the knowledge about, and that was interesting. But the more profound teachings were when I could speak from my firsthand experience. So applying all of that healing to myself enabled me to if you understand energetic grids and energetic systems, it's that the more that I worked on myself, the more that I became this beacon of light. It became like this vortex, this point where it's a grid, and these points of light start to work and on themselves, and then they radiate out, and it sends out a ripple that connects to other points on the planet. And they talked about it. I forget where I read it, an example. I'm struggling for the example, but there was something like one avatar could carry, one enlightened avatar, one wise avatar could carry a whole population. I forget the exact number, but let's say for purposes right now, let's say one avatar, one enlightened human being, one wise and wisdom person could actually hold the frequency or the energy of peace, and it would actually fan out in all the directions that would uphold say 100,000 people. And those concepts used to intrigue me, and I used to think that they were nice concepts until I started to realize the energetics of this and the capacity of the spiritual, because we're all one and we're all connected, that if you can clean up your own act, if you can clean up and raise your own consciousness and move out into the world in that fashion, and sure, you're going to help whoever you encounter along the way, or you're going to help them learn how to help themselves. I think that's the most practical thing that we can do, is keep developing ourselves, keep teaching other people to help themselves, and then they in turn should go and help some other people to help themselves, and then that person goes and teaches another group to help themselves. And that's why people were saying to me now, they said you need to teach more people to help themselves, to train people, to train other people to help themselves, to be trainers of this, rather than me just sitting doing the delivery and doing the what some people would call grunt work. Some of the times I'd be the one sitting in the classrooms, as opposed to the one teaching the people, or even looking for the people who are willing to come out and learn this in order to reach out to others. But I think it's possible, and that's what excited me about your wisdom gathering group, because it seemed like, oh, there's a potential, there's other people out there teaching other people other things. And the more that we can consolidate and put our ideas or our methods or our practices or our processes together, the more that we can come together and put those, like you said, your models out into the world. I think that's one way that we can apply, right, what we know and have long-lasting effects. I think where we came to today, we wouldn't be where we are today if there wasn't already some momentum, some already moving to bring us to where we are today. Because we're certainly not in the dark ages. If you look back, and I tell my students, give thanks that you're not living in the times of the gladiator, where even though some people would disagree, they say, well, then they didn't talk to you, then they didn't look at helping you, they just said off with your head kind of thing. And even though some of those things exist here to this day, it's still possible to be able to help in the evolution or the elevation, whichever word you want to use, of human consciousness, and to just by working on yourself and teaching others to do the same. But I've never seen anybody network that the way that you did, right? You're saying, I'm going to network it. We're going to pull you all together, and all of you have been working for years, and we're going to see what we can build from the discussion that's more on a practical basis. I've never seen that before, Sachin. So I got to commend you and thank you for your spirit push that moved you to gather all of the wisdom keepers, as you call them, to bring us together, because I think that's a very practical solution. And what we're going to build from that, I have no idea, but it's fun to even think about what might come from that kind of networking. But I also know that I've already done I'm doing my part just by clearing my own channel I already know that my soul came in to clear certain issues from not just me, but my family and community and my tribe and my people, right? Meaning Indigenous peoples. And I came in with that soul mission. So I know that by healing it and moving it through and clearing it through my own point, my own being, right? My own frequency, it will ripple out and touch other people's frequencies, and other people will step up, and different generations of people will step forward. So that's an energetic conversation, which I don't, I don't have a lot of people to talk to about that, so my vocabulary might not be as well formed. But I think you get the idea of this ripple effect from this one point of light, as it goes out and radiates and touches other points of light. And to me, it's a given. So my ancestors would say, well, if you're going to heal yourself, pay attention, because you're going to heal energetic cords going back 7 generations in either direction, for the future as well as the past. So even though my ancestors are no longer in physical form, the issues that they suffered with could be healed through me, which once I free myself up, then frees up future generations. And all I've done is heal myself in the present moment at the present time. So there are energetic terms, there are quantum physics and quantum science terms for what I just talked about, and there might be other people who can speak that better. But the concept of healing but previous generations and future generations just means that you have the ability to free up the imagination, which is the key to being spiritual. As you connect to the spiritual through active imagination, then you can actually dream up a new world. And if you can think it and you can see it, then you have the ability to make it happen. You can manifest it. And so that's what's exciting about the evolution of consciousness, because it has to expand. I suppose it could go down the other way, but I've always chosen to see it as an expansion, not as the spiraling. I don't know what's the opposite of contraction, I guess. Even though I know both are possible, I've chosen to see it as an expansion. So I choose to see it as an ever growing and ever expanding understanding of who we are. So if you can speak that kind of language, then it's not common language. You have to be that warrior, as you say, because people are going to look at you and think that you're talking gibberish, or thinking you're talking about, I mean, I get it a lot, right? Because there are people that are just saying, like, are wrinkling their nose and saying, like, what's that about? Like, what are you trying to say, or they don't believe that it's possible that you can create another reality by changing your thinking or expanding your thoughts. And there's lots of people who will dismiss that kind of, and dismiss you for being, so you had to be courageous. I mean, I had to be courageous because a lot of the stuff that I ended up teaching ended up being ahead of my time. And now, people are saying, yeah, that book you wrote in 1986, I really get that now. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm glad I wrote that one down. So yeah. So I mean, it's ever evolving, ever expanding, and I think, like, I accept that. I don't see that, and I just pray that I can see as much change in my lifetime, but I don't expect to see it all, because I know it's ever expanding.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Diane, for being. Diane, I want to thank you so much for being here today. Before we come to a closure, I would love you to, any last words for us warrior sages from your heart?
Oh.
Or even if you have a song or something for us, or some prayer, I would really appreciate that.
Oh, Sachin, you can't, when you think about the prayers, and you think about the way that things are done in my culture, they're very, very long. They're huge renditions, eh? And and so there isn't any sort of short there. Like if I did a Thanksgiving prayer, or if I brought that up, I'd have to go through almost every aspect of creation, starting from, moving from the sky world down into the earth. And they call that a Thanksgiving address. And in traditional times, it would take 5 days to do that, to run through that whole Thanksgiving. And nowadays they do it, and they can, like, young people will just kind of run it off, and they'll do it very in rote as quick as they can. And the danger about when you do things like that is then it becomes more rote, and then it does the meaningful thing that you would do. So it's like taking your time, right?
Yes.
And so it teaches you to slow down. It teaches you to have patience. It teaches you to reflect on every living thing in the creation that has provided for our sustenance, our nourishment, and our health. And that all those living things are not just outside of us, external to us, they're inside of us. And so you need to honor, you need to acknowledge that we aren't separate from the creation, that we are part and parcel, that we come from that, and we'll go back to that, and from which we came, eh? The spirit of me will go back to the star world, the sky world, and my body will go back to the Mother Earth from which it came. So the two parts of self, the spirit coming together with the physical body, that's why you have to acknowledge all those layers. You have to spend time knowing all those parts. You can't just do a fast track and of things. And that's what I think is missing. And maybe what COVID-19 gave us was it gave us a chance to slow down and a chance to really reflect, and that to realize that we aren't separate. Something invisible came and shut the whole world right down, and caused a pause, for all of us. So if that's what I would say as the closing words, is like, consider all things. And I mean consider. When they use that word, they mean it as a you really got to consider. You really got to reflect and consider. So it's not a quick fix. It's an evolutionary fix. And you'll contribute what you can, and I'll contribute what I can. And the world goes on. Because my teachings say it'll take many, many lifetimes just to learn how to be a good human being. And that's, yeah. So no quick fixes, but powerful understanding when you take the time to reflect and to look at all, and to consider all of the places, like we put ourselves inside of that creation, not separate from it, but with it, eh? Yeah, I'm descended from a very beautiful culture. So I'll leave it at that, Sajjan. We're not separate from. We're grateful for the opportunity to be here. And that gratitude is the highest spiritual principle you can aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Diane. All my love to the family as well, okay?
Thank you. Okay. Good night.